I'm Lydia See. I am finishing my third year at Western, my MFA. I am an artist that works with objects in the studio. I am a photographer and a weaver and a sculptor, and I run an organization called Engaging Collections, which is about the intersections of art and artists with libraries, archives, and special collections. So art was a huge part of my upbringing. So I spent most of my summers outdoors in a state park making art, and that was a major galvanizing part of my life, realizing that art could be used to connect people and build community. In my mid-20s, I started experimenting with photography off the wall, photography in a sculptural space, and I learned more about textiles and weaving, and that kind of became woven into my practice, if you will. For me, art is kind of a compulsion. Like, I can't not make photographs, I can't not make art, but I think it's less about personal expression and more about storytelling and story sharing for me. My practice is really informed by materials that have an identity before they get to me. And then my job, as I see it, is to interpret those materials or reframe them or use them in a different way to allow them to then embed information in objects that I'm making. So a lot of the work that ended up in my thesis included objects of significance to other people or to other circumstances that I tried to transform. The piece that is outside the Art Center is new real estate now available. And one of the main focuses of the work in my thesis show is the embedded symbolism in thinking about home and notions of home and housing, homelessness, historic effects on home ownership and property ownership, like de jure segregation. And so I was looking a lot at materials that signify that development or construction is happening. And so the new real estate now available piece pairs a chain link fence that has construction tarps hung on it, one large construction tarp that's announcing condos, and that has been wheat pasted with a lot of paper ephemera about development and construction from the 60s. And it also is wheat pasted with Cherokee Silberry that says, "You stand on Cherokee land." Next to that on the chain link fence are two quilts that I made that are actual barn quilts. Out in Western North Carolina, there's a barn quilt tour where you can drive around and look at barn quilts that have been painted on the side of barns. And those are also a signifier of this is a safe place. I found two quilt patterns and recreated them using that same construction tarp netting material. And then in front of that chain link is a child's playhouse that one of my fellow MFAs gave to me. Her kids had grown too big for it. And inside the house, I've used it as a gallery. And so the Playhouse Gallery has a selection of photographs hung inside of it. And each of those photographs are depicting a thing that looks like a home or is shaped like a home in the traditional Western idea of a square with a triangle on top, bird houses or plastic kids' playhouses. And then there's also a hand-painted birdhouse, which was painted by a friend of mine who actually lost their house and studio during COVID. The title of the work actually comes from that artist friend who, when they were announcing that they were selling these hand-painted birdhouses, they put a post up online that said, "New real estate now available, much more affordable than what you're used to." As is the case, a lot of the things that end up informing my work come from conversations with other people. So that whole piece is kind of a attempt to have a conversation about displacement, real estate, affordability, and it's left in public space instead of in a museum context, because I think even if it's free, even if the door is open, even if it's inviting, museum and gallery spaces can still be exclusionary. But by placing a piece of artwork out in public, you might have access to or interact with people that would not ordinarily step inside of a gallery or museum. So some of the tarps that I was talking about in the quilt pieces, a lot of these tarps have been hung outside advertising condos or housing, and then some of them were actually tarps that were hung outside during the renovation of the Asheville Art Museum. After I made the first 2 quilts, I was laying these tarps down on the floor of my studio and painting them from behind using a little block of wood. So pour the paint on, and the paint is all salvaged house paint. These tarps are a plastic woven, so they have a grid of perforation. So the paint would kind of squish through, and I'd let it dry for a few days and then pull it up. And as I did that with a few of the tarps, whenever I put more paint down, the paint that I poured from behind would lift the paint that had been left in the cracks of the tarp from the tarp before, if that makes sense. So what you started to get were these unpredictable anomalies. And so I did this intuitive painting process for a while. I knew that I wanted the works to have something to do with housing in a more explicit way. But I let them be for a while, and then when I was gearing up to start really planning my MFA show about a year ago, I spoke to a friend of mine about the graphic design and typography that's often used in real estate, and the words, kind of manipulative language that real estate uses, light-filled, open floor plan. I selected maybe 12 words of those real estate terms, and then I selected these very kind of cheesy, like brush script fonts or things that are very recognizable from billboards and advertisements, and projected them onto the tarps, and then I embroidered the words onto the tarps. And so one of them says custom, one of them says light-filled, and one of them says historic. Those are the 3 that are up in the MFA show in the museum right now. The wool that I used to embroider actually came out of the dumpster of a rug mill in Hendersonville that was closing. So all of the elements that went into them are salvaged materials that often end up in homes. The whole process took almost 2 years, I think. And I'm like really excited about them. It's probably the first time that I felt really, truly good about a process while I was in it. Usually, I think my work goes through several stages that you hate it for most of the time. And then if you're really lucky, sometimes you get to the point where you say, oh no, this is working. Okay, I can trust this process. So I am trusting that process right now, yeah.